There is a recording of the moment the USS Scorpion died. It was made by a single underwater microphone near La Palma in the Canary Islands, 821 nautical miles away from her. On it, the Atlantic crushes a nuclear submarine flat. The whole event takes about 1/10 of a second and releases energy on the order of 13,000 pounds of TNT. Analysts later pulled a fainter sound out of the record roughly 22 minutes before that one, and the fainter sound is where the analysis says the real damage was done. 99 men were aboard. It was the 22nd of May, 1968, and 58 years later the United States Navy still lists the cause of her loss as unknown. She is where she landed. Nearly 2 miles down in the open Atlantic, 400 miles southwest of the Azores, with a reactor and 2 nuclear torpedoes still inside her. In 1985, the Navy sent Robert Ballard back to those coordinates. He went down with a towed camera sled under classified orders, on a ship whose crew, by his own account, mostly had no idea what was beneath the keel, and he photographed everything that was left of her. The wreck was not the mystery. People have that part backwards. A submarine that implodes far below its crush depth and then slams into the seafloor looks exactly the way physics says it should look. Torn open and scattered, and ordinary in the worst possible way. What makes no sense is the paperwork stacked on top of it. 3 explanations for how those men died, produced by the Navy and by its own experts, that cannot all be true at once. A 4th that the admiral in charge put only in a private letter. One of them was conjectured by a court that had just finished saying the cause could not be determined. Another rested on a piece of the submarine hauled up from the seabed, examined under a microscope, and then set aside. Ballard was sent to settle the most dangerous version of the question, whether the Soviets had done it. He settled it. Then the mission was classified for another 23 years, and the answer to the question that actually mattered got further away instead of closer. The boat that was never supposed to be there. The Scorpion was a skipjack-class attack submarine, commissioned in 1960. 250 feet of teardrop hull wrapped around a single reactor, built to be fast and quiet and to hunt Soviet boats. 6 torpedo tubes. 2 of the weapons aboard carried nuclear warheads. Her crew called her Scrappyrone. It started as a joke. The record makes it look like less of one. A leaking propeller shaft seal. Hydraulic oil going where hydraulic oil should not go. Chronic freon leaks from the refrigeration plant. An electrical fire in an escape trunk after a water leak shorted a shore power connection. In March of 1968, Slattery himself drafted an emergency request for repairs, warning that the hull was in a very poor state of preservation, and that another year's delay could seriously jeopardize her readiness. None of which is what the Navy told the inquiry afterwards. Shada testified that her condition was above average, and her problems were routine. The squadron commander said he knew of nothing unsafe about her. The court accepted that and found her material condition excellent. A commanding officer's written warning went one way and the sworn testimony went the other, and that gap opens before any of the technical arguments start. And she was under a depth restriction, 500 feet, instead of the 700 she was built for. After the Thresher was lost with all hands in 1963, the Navy put limits like that on its older submarines while the new subsafe inspection and repair work was carried out on them. The Scorpion never received all of hers. The Chief of Naval Operations had approved a reduced overhaul, the cheapest given to any American submarine, and she sailed for the Mediterranean in February of 1968 with 109 work orders still unfilled. Remember that number, the 500, not the 109. She wasn't even supposed to be in the Mediterranean. She went as a last-minute stand-in for the USS Seawolf, which had been badly damaged in an accident that January. Accounts of that accident differ, and it doesn't matter much here. What matters is that the man who chose her replacement was Vice Admiral Arnold Shady, the 3-star commanding every submarine in the Atlantic Fleet, a decorated veteran of 11 war patrols against the Japanese. 3 months later, on the way home, her orders changed again. Instead of steaming straight for Norfolk, she was sent more than 1,000 miles southwest, down toward the Canary Islands to find and watch a small Soviet formation, an Echo II-class nuclear submarine. A submarine rescue vessel and 2 hydrographic survey ships joined a few days later by a guided missile destroyer and an oiler. The operations order that sent her there is still classified. American analysts assessed that the group was taking acoustic measurements of Western ships, which, if that assessment was right, would make it exactly the kind of activity an attack submarine gets quietly pointed at. Her last transmission went out on the evening of the 21st of May to a naval communication station in Greece. It gave her position, about 250 miles southwest of the Azores, and an arrival time. Norfolk, 1 o'clock, Monday the 27th. That message came into the ComSub-Lant message center, where 6 or 8 young radio men handled every signal to and from every submarine in the Atlantic. Their supervisor was a warrant officer and former submariner named John Walker. 5 days. Monday, the 27th of May, was miserable. A nor'easter was tearing across southeastern Virginia, and several dozen families were standing at the foot of Pier 22 in the rain with banners and balloons, and the wind kept taking their umbrellas. Teresa Bishop, married to the chief of the boat, waited in a car in the parking lot with friends. She had left her 3 children at a friend's house because of the storm. 1 o'clock came. Nothing. At 2:15, the Anti-Submarine Aviation Command got a phone call asking for long-range patrol aircraft immediately out of Norfolk and Bermuda. An hour after that, the Navy formally declared a submarine missing and ordered every ship in port ready to sail on 1 hour's notice. The families were told the weather was probably delaying the radio call. They went home not knowing. At 6 that evening, a local television station broke the story. Sonar technician First Class Bill Elrod had been aboard the Scorpion since 1964, and he was watching that broadcast in his apartment in Norfolk instead of standing in her control room. 11 days earlier, near the end of the deployment, he had been told his wife Julianne had gone into labor on the 16th of May and that their baby had died at birth. Commander Slattery diverted the submarine into Rota, Spain, and put him ashore on a tug. That is the only reason he was alive to see the news. He said later that he knew instantly. They never announced anything like that, he said, and when they announced it, he knew the boat was gone. 2 weeks after that, Hannon opened the local paper and read that Admiral Shady had testified under oath before the court of inquiry. In that testimony, the emergency began on Monday afternoon, when the submarine failed to show up. There was no mention of a missed check report on the Wednesday, no mention of the room full of senior officers that had appeared on the Thursday morning, 5 days before the boat was due. Nobody on the 7-member panel challenged him. 15 years later, Shada gave a telephone interview from his home in Florida, and he described organizing a search long before the Scorpion was due in Norfolk, using 2 squadrons of destroyers and long-range aircraft flying out of the Azores. He described the boat failing to check in and his command becoming suspicious within hours. He appears to have contradicted his own sworn testimony without noticing. I want to be careful here because this is where a story like this can slide into something it hasn't earned. None of that proves a conspiracy about the cause of the sinking. What it establishes is narrower and still ugly. The men in charge knew days before the people standing on that pier in the rain did. And the public timeline did not match what the admiral in charge said in private. 21 minutes and 50 seconds. To find her, the Navy turned to a mathematician. Dr. John Craven ran the Navy's Deep Submergence Special Projects Office, and his specialty was applying Bayesian probability to lost objects, a technique sharpened while hunting a hydrogen bomb dropped into the sea off Palomares, Spain in 1966. The Navy's big underwater listening system was useless to him because its arrays were tuned to filter out everything except Soviet machinery noise. Exactly the wrong filter. Craven and a naval research laboratory engineer named Wilton Hardy went to raw hydrophone data from Newfoundland and from the Canary Islands and found a sequence of sounds from the right patch of ocean at the right time. An acoustics specialist named Gordon Hamilton, who ran the Canary Islands station, worked that data into the tight search box that mattered most, and he gets a fraction of the credit Craven does. Analysts have counted those sounds differently over the years, which tells you something about how faint they were. One reading found 19 signals inside 91 seconds. Others put the count lower and the window longer. On the 28th of October 1968, the research ship Mizar found her. 40 years later, the story got sharper. In 2008, an engineer who had helped build the Navy's listening network handed over a 3-minute tape recorded by a single hydrophone near the island of La Palma, more than 800 nautical miles from where the Scorpion died. A career Navy acoustic analyst named Bruce Rule went through it and reconstructed the end almost second by second. None of what follows is an official Navy finding. It is one analyst's reading of one recording. It is also the most detailed reconstruction anyone has produced. At 18:20:44 Greenwich Mean Time on the 22nd of May, 2 explosions, half a second apart. Small ones, no more than about 20 pounds of TNT equivalent each in his calculation, and both contained inside the pressure hull. The Court of Inquiry's own record put the first event higher, somewhere above 30 pounds, and in another passage higher still, which is a reminder of how much of this is estimated from a smudge of sound. The submarine was at periscope depth. Working from the pressure those blasts would have generated, Rule concluded that the spaces forward of the reactor compartment saw overpressure several times what a human body survives, while the compartments aft of it stayed within survivable limits. He states the implication plainly, and it is a hard one. The hull was never breached. There was simply nobody left forward who could hold her up. Over the next 21 minutes and 50 seconds, the Scorpion sank vertically at about 7/10 of a knot, slower than you walk. At 18:42:34, the pressure hull collapsed. Depth 1,530 feet, derived from the frequency of the bubble pulse the collapse produced. Sea pressure, 680 pounds per square inch. It took about 1/10 of a second and released energy equivalent to roughly 13,000 pounds of TNT. Her depth restriction was 500 feet. The hydrophone kept recording after that. More collapses at greater depths as the tougher structures inside the wreckage gave way on the long fall to the bottom, including the torpedo tubes. What the cameras showed. In 1982, Robert Ballard went to the Navy looking for money to develop a towed camera system called Argo because he wanted to find the Titanic. Deputy Chief of Naval Operations Ronald Thunman later admitted he thought the idea was ridiculous. The Navy funded him anyway, with conditions. He would survey the Thresher first, then the Scorpion, photograph the reactors and the nuclear weapons, and establish whether the Soviet Union had been responsible for either loss. Anything left over was his own time. Ballard was put on temporary active duty and the operation was classified. Thresher in the summer of 1984, Scorpion in 1985. By his own account, the cover story held so well that the press never worked out what he was doing, and most of the people on that ship spent days floating above a war grave without being told what was underneath them. The wreck was in pieces, the sail torn off and lying separately from the hull sections. Most of the operations compartment simply gone, and most of the identifiable debris scattered across the site had come from it. Ballard has described the 2 submarines he was sent to photograph as looking like something put through a shredding machine. The reactor had shut itself down. Nothing in the survey suggested it was contaminating the water around her, and nothing suggested the fuel had been breached. The 2 nuclear torpedoes were still on the seabed, and nothing was coming out of those either. And nothing in the imagery showed damage from a weapon striking her from outside, which had been the entire point of sending him, and which matched what the analysts looking at the earlier photographs had already concluded. 3 answers, and only one of them has physical evidence. In January 1969, the Navy released the Court of Inquiry's finding, and it was a shrug. The certain cause cannot be determined from the available evidence. Its record, written before the wreck had even been located, had listed a most probable cause anyway. That one of her own Mark 37 torpedoes had gone into a hot run in the tube, that the crew had expelled it, and that it had then come back and destroyed her. A large charge, detonating outside the pressure hull. The first half of that had a precedent. In December of 1967, the Scorpion had dealt with an accidentally activated Mark 37 in a firing tube and got rid of it before anything happened. Then the wreck was found, and Craven's technical advisory group went to work on the acoustics and produced the detail everything else hangs on. At the moment of the first explosion, the Scorpion had not been heading west toward Norfolk. She had been heading east. The group's reading was that she had thrown herself into a hard U-turn, which is what you do to trigger a torpedo's anti-circular run safety, and that the weapon had detonated anyway. Craven told a reporter it was the only version that fit everything. He also said something that sits awkwardly against the court's external explosion. Looking at the same photographs, he saw no visible damage from outside the hull at all. On June 29, 1970, a group of submarine designers and engineers called the Structural Analysis Group delivered a third answer. They had something nobody else had: a physical piece of the Scorpion. The bathyscaphe Trieste. 2 had recovered a section of the cover from her main storage battery, a 65-ton, 126-cell unit. Microscopic examination, spectrographic analysis, and X-ray diffraction went into it, and into the battery fragments scattered through the debris field. What they found was that pieces of a flash arrestor had been driven at high speed into both faces of that recovered cover, the inside and the outside, and the terminal post was damaged and the cover violently torn. Their reasoning from there is careful rather than dramatic. Damage like that could in principle be an after effect of the hull imploding. But water is dense, and particles traveling through a flooded battery well would have hit far more softly than these did. So the more probable sequence in their reading was that the battery exploded first and the well flooded afterwards. They did not present it as certainty. They concluded that a battery explosion best matched the whole body of evidence they had examined. Hydrogen coming off lead-acid submarine batteries had been a known killer for decades. On February 21, 1955, the forward group of a battery from the same family blew up aboard the USS Pomadan during a dockside charge in San Francisco. 5 men died. A fourth reading exists, and it belongs to Shada. In a letter to the president of the court, he put his money on the trash disposal unit, a hatch in the galley separated from high-pressure seawater by a valve, which the Scorpion had flooded through before. Come up to periscope depth, dump the rubbish, get a broken latch and a mistake at the same time, and you have seawater coming through the operations compartment and down onto a battery several decks below. That produces hydrogen, which brings you back to the same explosion by a different road. The two theories that look like rivals may be describing one accident from opposite ends. The battery assessment went nowhere. The court had already weighed a battery explosion, back before the analysts got hold of the physical evidence, and set it down as possible but not probable, without much comment. It had reasons. The battery still had more than a year of guaranteed service life in it, and when it was tested in January of 1968, it delivered 106% of rated capacity. But the court submitted its findings before the structural analysis group finished, and nobody brought it back afterwards to sit down with the men who had spent a year and a half on a recovered piece of the submarine. The official cause stayed exactly where it was, which is to say nowhere. Their report was classified until the Chief of Naval Operations released it in 1998, 30 years after the sinking. When part of that same group was quietly brought back together in 1987 to go through the photographs Woods Hole had handed the Navy after Ballard's survey, they looked at the images and concluded that nothing in them changed their minds. So the record we have is a court that could not determine a cause and then proposed one regardless, a proposed mechanism that hangs on a course reversal. The acoustic reanalysis says never happened, an external detonation that left no external damage on the hull Ballard photographed 17 years later, and a laboratory finding on a recovered piece of the submarine that was pushed to one side by people who never sat down with the men who produced it. The man in the message center. There is one more fact about that night, and it explains nothing. The warrant officer supervising the comms sublant message center, the man Mike Hannon knocked on the door of at midnight, the man who then helped encode and decode the traffic about the search for a missing nuclear submarine, was John Anthony Walker Jr. In October of 1967, 7 months before the Scorpion was lost, Walker had driven to Washington, walked into the Soviet embassy, and offered to sell what he had access to. The KGB station chief, Boris Solomatin, met him personally, which almost never happened with someone off the street. What he handed over included settings for the KL-47, the cipher machine that protected messages going to and from American submarines. He kept selling until his arrest in 1985, recruited his brother, his son, and a friend, and compromised something on the order of 1 million classified messages. One caveat that the people who have studied the ring closest keep attaching to this: it has never been established that the Soviets had any immediate operational use for that first key list. Having the keys is one thing. Reading a specific submarine's orders in real time is another, and nothing in the record shows the second one happened. This is still why the Soviet theory has never died, and why it deserves an honest answer instead of a smirk. Its most serious advocate is the journalist Ed Offley, who argues the Scorpion was tracked and attacked, and who points out that Hannon and another radio man both recalled senior officers in that room openly discussing a sinking and a Soviet submarine leaving the area at speed. But no investigation in 58 years has established any link between Walker's espionage and the loss of the Scorpion. The court found no unusual radio traffic coming off those Soviet ships, and the hydrophones picked up no torpedo explosions. When the wreck finally turned up, it was hundreds of miles from that flotilla, which had carried on working the same patch of water off the Canaries as though nothing had happened. Craven, with the acoustic record in front of him, could find no external detonation in it. Bruce Rule went back over the same sound 4 decades later and concluded the boat never reversed course at all. Then the cameras went down in 1985 and photographed an undamaged hull. A coincidence of personnel is not a cause. What it is an explanation for why people never trusted the official story. A record that contradicted itself would be enough on its own, and this one came with a spy sitting at the desk where the messages landed. People fill vacuums. The Navy left a very large one. What is down there now? She is still on eternal patrol at 32 degrees 55 minutes north, 33 degrees 9 minutes west, and the Navy has been going back to check on her. Sediment and water samples were collected near the wreck in 1979, 1986, and 1998, along with samples of whatever was living down there. Trace cobalt-60 has turned up in sediment close by, and the reading taken from that is fairly specific. Cobalt-60 is what you get when metal inside a reactor plant is activated by neutrons, so it points to plant hardware rather than to the fuel itself. No sampling has found evidence of radioactivity escaping the fuel elements. The 1986 and 1998 campaigns went looking for plutonium from the 2 nuclear weapons as well. What they measured matched the background left across the whole planet by atmospheric weapons testing. The Navy's published position is that the wreck has had no discernible effect on radioactivity in the environment. So she is quiet. Whatever else went wrong on the 22nd of May, the reactor did the one thing it was designed to do on the way down, and it has held for 58 years. The trail. Ballard finished at the Scorpion with 12 days of ship time left. A French vessel had already spent 5 weeks sweeping ahead of him with side-scan sonar and found nothing, so he stopped hunting for a ship. Mapping 2 dead submarines had taught him that a wreck at that depth does not land in one piece. It lays down a debris trail across the seabed, and a trail is an enormous target compared to a hull. He said afterwards it was like tracking a deer through snow. You follow the footprints. At 2 in the morning on the 1st of September, 1985, Argo found the Titanic. He has described the mood on that ship flipping like a light switch once the excitement passed, the realization that they were standing on someone's grave. He knew that feeling already. He had spent the summer doing it twice. The most famous shipwreck discovery of the 20th century was a byproduct of a mission to find out whether the Soviet Union had killed 228 American sailors. It stayed secret until Ballard talked about it in 2008. And the Scorpion was one of 4 submarines lost in 1968, from 4 different navies, within months of each other. Israel's Dakar, France's Minerve, and the Soviet K-129, which the CIA later tried to steal off the seafloor using a fake mining ship and Howard Hughes. That one is next. The link is on screen.